The control panel flickered erratically, casting ghostly shadows against the walls of the abandoned command station. The air was thick with the scent of burned circuitry and something deeper, something metallic, blood, perhaps. Commander Ethan Vance shifted his stance, fingers flexing over the grip of his sidearm as he scanned the room. The silence was unnatural, a void pressing in from every direction. Behind him, Selara moved with practiced ease, her silver-hued skin nearly luminous in the dim light. Her violet eyes flickered with calculation, but it was the way she whispered that set his nerves alight. "We are alone, now let's do what must be done." The words settled heavily between them, laden with meaning he wasn't sure he wanted to face. She had always spoken with measured intensity, but this was different. This was final. Ethan exhaled slowly. "That depends on what you think must be done." She studied him for a moment, then turned toward the central console. It was half-melted from whatever had hit the base before their arrival, but her hands moved over the surface with purpose. A hidden compartment clicked open, revealing a cylindrical device no larger than his palm. A data core, one of the old models, analog encryption, impossible to hack remotely. His stomach twisted. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." Selara glanced up, her gaze unreadable. This station was supposed to be wiped before it fell into enemy hands. It wasn't. He swore under his breath. The war between the Coalition and the Dominion had raged for years, each side desperate to outmaneuver the other. If an intact archive remained, it could contain classified movements, hidden bases, secrets that could tip the balance of power. She held the data core out to him. "We destroy this now, or it gets into the wrong hands." There was something she wasn't saying. He knew her well enough to recognize it. Their marriage had been a political arrangement, an uneasy truce between factions who hated each other, but he had learned to ride her through necessity, if not trust. Her shoulders were too stiff, her breath too measured. "This isn't just about the war," he said quietly. Her fingers tightened around the core. "No." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Then what?" She hesitated. That alone was enough to send unease crawling up his spine. Selara never hesitated. "The data in here," she exhaled sharply, looking away. "It's not just military. It's about us." Ethan frowned. "Yes?" "The negotiations, the conditions of our union, the classified reports on our compatibility." She shook her head, frustration bleeding into her tone. "Everything about how we were chosen, manipulated, watched." A slow realization dawned. Their marriage had never been about peace. It had always been about something deeper, something orchestrated beyond their understanding. He thought back to the vague reports, the unexplained orders, the way their superiors had always seemed more invested in their relationship than the war itself. His pulse pounded. "They've been monitoring us." "Yes." She met his gaze, eyes burning. "And we need to decide what we do next." The weight of it settled over him like a crushing force. Destroying the data would mean severing whatever control their respective governments had over them, but it would also mean walking into uncertainty. What had once been a reluctant alliance had become something more, something neither of them had ever spoken aloud. The choice loomed before them, stark and undeniable. Outside, the station creaked under its own ruin. A distant explosion rumbled through the walls, a reminder that time was slipping through their fingers. Ethan reached for the data core, his fingers brushing against hers. "Tell me you trust me." She studied him, then whispered, "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." For the first time since this war began, Ethan wasn't sure which side he was fighting for. The station's corridors were a skeletal maze of collapsed bulkheads and flickering emergency lights. Each step sent echoes bouncing into the void, the silence between them heavier than the distant hum of the dying structure. Ethan gripped the data core, its weight deceptively slight in his palm, yet it carried the power to unravel everything they knew. Selara moved beside him with the same fluid grace she always did, but her shoulders were rigid, her gaze flicking over every shadow. "We need to get to the reactor core," she said finally. "The heat will incinerate it completely." Ethan glanced at her. "And then what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she quickened her pace, forcing him to follow. He knew what she was doing, avoiding the question, avoiding the implications. Destroying the data meant severing the last tether between them and their old lives. Without it, neither the Coalition nor the Dominion could use them anymore. They would be free. Or they would be hunted. A distant tremor rattled through the station, sending a shower of dust from the overhead panels. Ethan instinctively reached for his sidearm, but Seara's hand shot out, stilling him. She tilted her head, listening. A moment later, a low mechanical whirring filled the air. "Defense drones." He swore under his breath. "They shouldn't be active." Seara's eyes narrowed. "Unless someone else is here." Ethan tightened his grip on the core. If either side had dispatched a retrieval team, their window of opportunity was closing fast. He gestured to the junction ahead. "We take the maintenance tunnels. Less exposed." She nodded, and they slipped into the narrow passage, weaving through conduits and pipes thick with condensation. The air was heavier here, laced with the sharp tang of coolant and rust. Ethan took the lead, moving with practiced efficiency, but his mind was elsewhere, on her, on what came next. They had spent so long orbiting around each other, bound by duty, by the illusion of necessity. He had never questioned it before, had never allowed himself to. But now, with the weight of their choices pressing in, he found himself wondering what she would have been to him if things had been different. The tunnel opened into a dimly lit service bay. Selara stepped past him, scanning their surroundings before finally exhaling. "Clear." Ethan leaned against the wall, regarding her. "Back there, when I asked what happens next. You never answered." She turned, folding her arms. "Because I don't know." He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "That's a first." Her gaze softened, just a fraction. "I was trained to anticipate outcomes. To read situations before they unfold. But this?" She gestured between them. "I never saw this coming." Neither had he. He stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "If we do this, we don't have a side anymore. No safe harbor, no command to call home." She held his gaze. "Would that be so bad?" The question lingered between them, heavier than any order they had ever followed. A sudden burst of static crackled through the room. Both of them snapped to attention as a garbled voice echoed through the overhead speakers. Someone was accessing the station's comms, but the signal was distorted, unreadable. Selara moved to a nearby terminal, fingers flying across the controls. Ethan tensed. "If they're trying to establish a link, we need to move. Now." She gave a sharp nod. "The reactor's just ahead. Let's finish this." But as they made their way forward, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the real choice had already been made. The reactor chamber loomed before them, a cavernous expanse of exposed machinery and thrumming energy conduits. The air shimmered with residual heat, waves of distortion curling around the massive core that pulsed like a dying star. Ethan adjusted his grip on the data core, its cool surface pressing into his palm as he and Selara crossed the grated walkway. She moved with purpose, her violet gaze locked onto the control panel near the containment vents. Every movement was precise, deliberate, yet Ethan sensed something beneath the surface. A hesitation. A weight pressing against the choice they were about to make. He stepped beside her, voice low. "This is it." She didn't look at him immediately. Instead, she exhaled, pressing her hands against the console as if grounding herself. Finally, she turned, expression unreadable. Once it's gone, so is any chance of knowing the full truth. He nodded, jaw tightening. And any chance of them using us? Selara studied him for a long moment, then held out her hand. He placed the data core in her palm, and for a heartbeat, she simply stared at it, the flickering light casting elongated shadows across her face. Then, without a word, she moved to the reactor's waste chute. The alarms came first. A piercing klaxon that vibrated through the walls, followed by the sudden red glow of emergency lights. Ethan spun toward the exit, instinct screaming at him even before the comm system crackled to life. Halt. You are unauthorized. Stand down and await retrieval. The voice was mechanical, stripped of identity, but the cold finality in the command sent adrenaline surging through his veins. A security team was here. They had minutes, maybe less. Seara's hand hovered over the release mechanism. She turned to him, eyes burning with unspoken words. If we do this, they'll never stop hunting us. Ethan met her gaze, steady. They already won't. A single nod, and she pressed the switch. The data core tumbled through the chute, disappearing into the reactor's inferno. The chamber shuddered as containment fields shifted to compensate for the sudden disruption. Ethan reached for his weapon as footsteps pounded against metal. Figures in armored exosuits surged into the chamber, rifles raised. Hands where we can see them. Selara didn't move. Neither did Ethan. They had made their choice. And now, there was no turning back. The soldiers advanced with military precision, their weapons trained, the cold gleam of their visors reflecting the pulsing reactor light. Ethan's pulse hammered, but he forced himself to remain still, his mind racing through contingencies. Surrender meant interrogation, imprisonment, maybe worse. Fighting meant slim odds of escape. Beside him, Selara remained motionless, her expression unreadable, but he knew her well enough to recognize the tension coiled beneath the surface. She was calculating, assessing, searching for the single moment where probability bent in their favor. A voice crackled through the lead soldier's helmet. You've compromised classified intelligence. By order of the Dominion, you are to be taken into custody. Selara scoffed softly. The Dominion? Her voice was sharp, laced with quiet defiance. No coalition forces? That's telling. Ethan caught the flicker of hesitation in the soldier's stance, a brief pause that spoke volumes. The coalition wasn't here. That meant either they didn't know yet, or they had already written him off. His grip on his sidearm tightened, but he kept it low, unreadable. And if we don't comply? The soldier took a measured step forward. Then we shoot. The words hung in the charged air, and in that instant, Ethan saw it, the opening, the moment where everything could shift. He didn't hesitate. A sharp movement. A flash of metal. A single, precise shot. The lead soldier staggered as Selara struck, her blade slicing between the armor plates at his throat. Before his body hit the floor, Ethan was already moving, yanking his weapon free and firing into the second nearest target. The chamber erupted into chaos. Selara was a blur, weaving between the soldiers with lethal efficiency, her movements fluid, honed by years of training. Ethan covered her, each shot calculated, precise, their coordination an unspoken language of survival. The soldiers faltered, unprepared for the sheer ferocity of their resistance. Within moments, the last body slumped to the ground. The alarms continued to wail, a relentless countdown to whatever reinforcements were surely en route. Selara turned to Ethan, chest rising and falling with steady control. We need to go. Now. He nodded, stepping over the fallen as they sprinted toward the emergency exit. The station trembled beneath them, the reactor's energy surging in unstable bursts. As they reached the docking bay, Ethan caught her wrist, forcing her to meet his gaze. Where do we go from here? For the first time, she hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from something deeper, something unspoken. Anywhere but back, she murmured. That was enough. Without looking back, they boarded the stolen vessel, the engines roaring to life. As they shot into the abyss of space, leaving the wreckage and their past behind, Ethan found himself gripping the controls with a strange sense of finality. They had burned every bridge. Now, they had only each other. The stolen vessel cut through the void, its engines leaving a trail of ionized gas dissipating into the endless black. Ethan kept his hands steady on the controls, watching the navigation screen as their trajectory pulled them further from the war they had just abandoned. The Dominion would be hunting them. The Coalition, too, once they realized what had happened. They weren't just deserters, they were loose ends. Selara sat in the co-pilot's seat, silent, her gaze fixed on the viewport. The dim glow of distant stars flickered across her silver-hued skin, but her expression was unreadable. He could feel the weight of her thoughts, the same questions pressing against his own mind. After several long moments, she spoke. We need destination. Ethan exhaled slowly. Somewhere off the grid. A place where no one's tracking flight paths or running facial scans. Her fingers danced over the console, pulling up a star map riddled with red zones, territories controlled by either the Dominion or the Coalition. Nearly every safe harbor was marked, monitored, or too dangerous to risk. But then she tapped a point at the edge of the screen, where no flags or identifiers existed. The whale sector, she said. No official governance, no military prisons. Just old outposts, salvage stations, and independent traders. Ethan frowned. Pirate territory. She glanced at him. That's the point. No one controls it, which means no one will be looking for us there. It was a risk, but so was staying anywhere else. He nodded and adjusted their course. Whale sector it is. Silence stretched between them again, but this time, it wasn't just about logistics. The question that neither of them had dared to voice lingered in the air. What now? They had spent years fighting, obeying orders, existing within the confines of duty. Without that, without the war shaping every decision they made, what were they? Ethan finally leaned back, letting out a quiet laugh. Never thought I'd end up a fugitive. Selara smirked, a rare glimmer of amusement in her violet eyes. Then you weren't paying attention. He met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. They had always been on the fringes, used, controlled, never fully trusted by either side. Maybe this had been inevitable. Maybe the only way to survive had always been to break free. The ship's sensors pinged, pulling their focus back to the screen. A small station loomed ahead, rusted and ancient, barely holding itself together in the gravity well of a dying star. Selara tilted her head. Looks like our kind of place. Ethan sighed, gripping the controls. Let's see if we can buy ourselves a future. As they approached, he knew one thing for certain, whatever came next, they would face it together. The docking clamps groaned as the ship settled onto the rusted platform, the station's failing artificial gravity straining to hold everything together. Through the viewport, Ethan could see the flickering neon glow of mismatched signage, the kind of place where names were optional, and pasts were best left buried. Whale stations like this thrived on silence and secrecy, perfect for them, if they played it right. Selara powered down the ship, her movements efficient but tense. We don't stay long, she said. Fuel, supplies, information. Then we move. Ethan nodded, strapping his sidearm to his thigh as he stood. Agreed. But we are going to need credits. She glanced at him, eyes narrowing slightly. And how exactly do you plan to get those? He gave a worried smile. I'll figure something out. The station's airlock cycled open with a sluggish hiss, the scent of stale oxygen and machine oil filling his lungs as they stepped onto the platform. The interior was dimly lit, the metal walls covered in decades of grime, illuminated by the occasional flickering console. The corridors stretched ahead, filled with traders, mercenaries, and the kind of people who didn't ask questions unless they were paid to. Selara moved beside him, her presence a steadying force. They had walked through war zones, infiltrated enemy strongholds, faced death more times than either of them could count, but this was something new. Here, survival wasn't about winning a battle. It was about disappearing. A vendor's stall loomed to the right, shelves stacked with ration packs and outdated medkits. Ethan approached, slipping into the practiced ease of someone who belonged. "We need supplies." The vendor, a thick-set humanoid with ridged skin and tired eyes, barely looked up. "Then you need credits." Ethan leaned in slightly. "Maybe there's another way." The vendor snorted, finally meeting his gaze. "What kind of trouble are you offering?" Selara shifted beside him, and Ethan could feel her barely restrained impatience, but he knew how these places worked. Everything was a transaction, and sometimes, the currency wasn't just money. "I can handle problems," Ethan said, his tone casual. "The kind that come with a price." The vendor studied him for a long moment before gesturing toward the far end of the market. "Talk to the barkeep at the hollow. If you survive, I might be willing to trade." Ethan exhaled, nodding. "Appreciate it." As they walked away, Seara's voice was low. "This is a bad idea." He gave her a sideways glance. "It's a necessary one." She didn't argue, but he could feel her unease. He wasn't thrilled either. Whatever job waited for them at the hollow, it wouldn't be clean. But clean wasn't an option anymore. They stepped into the cantina, the air thick with the scent of spilled liquor and old smoke. A dozen pairs of eyes flicked toward them before losing interest, except for one. A heavy-set man at the bar, scars lining his face, watching them with the patience of someone who knew exactly how things worked here. Ethan squared his shoulders and stepped forward. "I hear you've got work." The man studied him, then Selara. A slow smile spread across his lips. "That depends," he said. "How far are you willing to go?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "As far as it takes." The man's grin widened. "Then we might just have a deal." The weight of the moment settled between them. Whatever came next wouldn't be easy, but it was a path forward. And for now, that was enough. The scarred man poured himself a drink, the umber liquid sloshing slightly in the chipped glass. He didn't offer Ethan or Selara one. Instead, he took a slow sip, saving it before setting the glass down with a deliberate clink. His gaze remained fixed on them, measuring, calculating. Ethan didn't move. Neither did Selara. "You look like soldiers," the man said finally, voice rough from years of bad air and worse choices. "Not the kind that take orders anymore, though." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Is that going to be a problem?" The man chuckled. "Not for me. But it means you are desperate. And desperate people do stupid things." Seara's voice was quiet, sharp. "We are not stupid." The man smirked. "We'll see." He leaned forward slightly, his presence pressing against the space between them. "There's a shipment coming through in 6 hours. High-value cargo. Dominion-backed, but off the record. Unregistered, which means no official escorts. Just a private security team. It's passing through a docking ring at the edge of the sector. You help me take it, and we all walk away richer." Ethan exhaled slowly, already running the calculations in his head. It was a classic hijack, quick, brutal, and full of risks. The Dominion rarely let stolen assets go unanswered, and if this shipment was important enough to be off the books, then it was important enough for someone to come looking. Selara didn't react, but he knew she was thinking the same thing. What's the cargo? The man's grin widened, teeth flashing in the dim light. Does it matter? Ethan held his gaze. It does to us. For a moment, the man simply stared at him, the easy smirk slipping just slightly. Then he let out a quiet chuckle and reached for his drink again. Let's just say it's valuable to the right people. And the wrong people wouldn't want it in the open. He took a sip, eyes gleaming over the rim. You in or not? Ethan glanced at Selara. A choice, unspoken, passed between them. This was dangerous. But so was starving, and so was running forever with nothing to show for it. Ethan turned back to the man. We are in. The smirk returned. Good. Be at Dock C-Barra in 5 hours. Don't be late. Without another word, Ethan and Selara turned and left the cantina. The moment they stepped back into the dimly lit corridors of the station, she finally spoke. This is a mistake. He sighed. You think everything's a mistake? This one more than usual. Her voice was low, tense. We don't know what we are walking into. We don't know who we are dealing with. And we don't know what's in that shipment. He met her gaze, unflinching. You want to back out? She held his stare for a long moment before exhaling, her shoulders shifting slightly. No. That was all the answer he needed. They walked in silence through the station, the echoes of distant conversations and humming machinery filling the spaces between them. This wasn't what they had planned. But at least, for the first time in a long time, they had a direction. For better or worse, they had made their choice. And soon, they would find out what it cost them. The docking bay was a skeletal framework of rusted metal and flickering lights, suspended in the emptiness at the station's outer ring. From their vantage point above the loading area, Ethan and Selara watched the Dominion freighter settle into place, its hull pockmarked from years of service. It was an old model, standard cargo hauler, but the escort detail was anything but standard. 4 armed guards in matte black armor moved into position as the airlock cycled open. This was no routine shipment. Selara shifted beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. Too much security for just supplies. Ethan agreed, but they were past the point of second thoughts. The scarred man, Talon, as he had introduced himself, was waiting at the lower level with a small team of mercenaries, their weapons ready. There was no room for hesitation now. Ethan checked his rifle, then met Seara's gaze. We stick to the plan. Get in, neutralize resistance, get out. She nodded, but he could see the tension in her eyes. They had been in worse situations before. But back then, they had the weight of an army behind them. Now, it was just them, a handful of hired guns, and a deal with a man they barely trusted. A sharp buzz in his earpiece signaled Talon's voice. Move in 5. Ethan exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Then he and Selara slipped down the access ladder, silent as shadows. The moment their boots hit the platform, the countdown was over. Talon's team struck first, explosive charges blasting open the docking bay's security doors. The guards barely had time to react before the first shots rang out, bright streaks of energy lighting up the dim space. Ethan surged forward, rifle up, squeezing off to controlled bursts. One guard crumpled. Another spun, returning fire, forcing him behind cover. Selara moved like a blade through the chaos, cutting across the loading area and dropping low behind a stack of crates. A second later, her sidearm hissed, a precision shot punching through another guard's visor. The last two tried to retreat into the freighter, but Talon's men were faster. A single concussive blast sent them sprawling. The echoes of the firefight faded, leaving only the hum of the freighter's idle engines. Ethan moved quickly, stepping over the fallen guards as he reached the loading ramp. The ship's interior was dark, the only illumination coming from the sparse glow of emergency lights. Selara was right behind him, scanning the corridors, her expression unreadable. "Cargo hold should be just ahead," Talon muttered as he stepped inside, two of his men flanking him. "Let's see what's so damn important." They moved in formation, clearing each section as they went. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, like the ship itself was holding its breath. When they reached the main storage bay, Ethan keyed the control panel, releasing the magnetic locks. The door slid open with a slow, metallic groan. Inside, rows of cryopods lined the hold. Not weapons. Not supplies. People. Ethan's stomach tightened. He stepped closer, wiping the frost from one of the pods. A pale-skinned figure lay inside, motionless, locked in artificial sleep. Not Dominion soldiers. Not prisoners. Civilians. Selara cursed under her breath. What the hell is this? Talon's smirk was gone. He stared at the pods, then let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Well, this just got interesting. Ethan turned to face him, his grip tightening on his rifle. Explain. Talon exhaled, rubbing his jaw. I had my suspicions, but this? This is a whole other level. He gestured at the frozen bodies. The Dominion's been running quiet operations, disappearing people. Refugees, dissidents, anyone inconvenient. No one ever sees them again. Now we know why. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. They're transporting them like cargo. Talon nodded. Looks that way. Seara's voice was sharp. And what were you planning to do with them? Talon's grin returned, slow and calculated. Sell them back to the right people, of course. Or ransom them off. War's expensive, sweetheart. Someone's always willing to pay. Ethan didn't like the way he said it, didn't like the way his men shifted, hands inching toward their weapons. He glanced at Selara. A silent understanding passed between them. This wasn't a job anymore. This was choice. Talon's smile faded as he noticed the change in their stances. His fingers curled toward his sidearm. Now, let's not do anything stupid. Ethan leveled his rifle at him. Too late for that. The moment stretched, taut and unyielding. And then the shooting started. The first shot came from one of Talon's men, a sharp crack that sent energy sizzling past Ethan's head. He dropped low, rolling behind a cryopod as the cargo hold erupted in chaos. Selara was already moving, twin bursts from her sidearm punching into the nearest mercenary's chest before he could fire again. Talon dove behind a stack of crates, barking orders as his men fanned out. "You're making a mistake, soldier," he called, voice edged with something between frustration and amusement. "You think the Dominion gives a damn about these people? They're as good as dead anyway." Ethan ignored him. He peeked around the pod, sighting another target. A squeeze of the trigger, and the man collapsed, clutching his side. Another mercenary returned fire, forcing Ethan back down. He could hear Selara moving, always precise, always relentless. They were outnumbered, but Talon's men hadn't expected betrayal. That was their only advantage. A sharp hum filled the air as one of the mercenaries activated an energy blade, its glow casting jagged shadows against the walls. He rushed Ethan's position, boots thudding against the deck. Ethan twisted at the last second, bringing his rifle up to block the downward strike. Sparks flew as metal met crackling energy. He drove his knee into the man's stomach, then twisted the rifle, using the momentum to send him sprawling. Before the mercenary could recover, Selara put a round through his helmet. Ethan exhaled, nodding his thanks before turning his attention back to Talon. The scarred man was still crouched behind cover, eyes cold and calculating. He wasn't panicking. He was waiting. For what? Then Ethan heard it, the heavy clang of boots on metal. Reinforcements. Talon grinned. Should have taken the deal, kid. Ethan didn't waste breath on a reply. He grabbed Selara arm, jerking his head toward the exit. She understood immediately. They had to move. The ship trembled slightly as something docked onto it. Ethan's mind raced. More of Talon's men. Dominion patrol? Either way, they wouldn't last in a prolonged fight. Selara had already sprinted ahead, her footfalls silent as she weaved through the rows of cryopods. Ethan followed, keeping his rifle up, ready for anything. Behind them, Talon's laughter echoed. Run all you want. You'll never get them out of here. Ethan clenched his jaw. That was the problem, wasn't it? The cryopods weren't portable. They needed power, transport. They weren't saving anyone if they just left. The corridor ahead split into two paths, one leading toward the docking bay, the other deeper into the freighter. Selara hesitated. We can make it back to the station, regroup. Ethan shook his head. And leave them? She exhaled sharply but didn't argue. They both knew what had to be done. He turned toward the ship's control center. We take the freighter. Selara gave a small, grim smile. Now you are thinking like a soldier. They sprinted down the hall as the sound of approaching boots grew louder. Ethan didn't look back. They weren't done yet.